Parental guidance is advised for the following program. He charmed them and disarmed them.
Well, he was a young, good-looking sort of chap, and he was very much a boy next door, travelling the world. You know, you talk to people on planes. You don't really have relationships, but you think, oh, well, he's okay.
I do not find anything abnormal about his behavior the time that I spent with him.
But behind the charming tourist lay a villain harboring a skill of a different kind.
Looking at the way in which the parts came in, and the fact that there was no damage to the articular surfaces, the surface of the joints, it suggests that somebody was very skillful at dismemberment process.
His motivation was pure greed, the simplest way to get money for somebody who's not that smart.
Singapore, known as the Garden City, is a small country situated 60 miles north of the equator and home to 5 million people. It is also one of the busiest ports in the world. In 1995, Clifford Pier was a popular marine terminal in the busy financial district of Singapore. Boats and barges loaded with construction workers routinely plied the waters between the pier and Singapore's lesser-known southern islands. On March 13th, an unusual package was spotted floating in the waters. Zain Al-Abidin, a duty officer at the time with the Singapore police force, was assigned to the case.
At that time, it was not uncommon to find limbs and dead bodies washed ashore because of marine accident and cases of illegal immigrants that fall into the sea. So I thought that it was just an ordinary case of such similar cases.
But the discovery turned out to be something gruesome.
When I was informed about the pair of legs found off Clifford Pier by the police coast guard, I was directed to attend the post-mortem to verify if there's any foul play.
The bin liner floating off Clifford Pier contained 2 decomposed human legs, both severed at the knee. Immediately, the find was sent to the Singapore General Hospital mortuary, where senior pathologist, the late Professor Chow Tse Ching, performed an autopsy. Dr. Paul Chui from the Singapore Forensic Medicine Division remembers the professor's findings.
The legs were a bit decomposed, and the time of death was suggested to be about 1.5 to 2 days prior to the time of discovery. Prof. Chow noted that the articular surfaces, that is the surfaces of the bone that forming the joint, were not damaged. There was no evidence of any cutting into these surfaces, as well as the fact that the skin wound at the point of the disarticulation were very neatly done.
Upon further examination, Professor Chow's conclusions suggested something far more macabre.
Based on the manner in which the parts were dismembered, it suggests that somebody was very skillful at doing this and probably had prior knowledge of anatomy to be able to do the dismemberment in such a manner. This person could have been a surgeon, a medical student, a doctor, perhaps a butcher.
With a potential killer on the loose, investigators knew the importance of identifying the body and went straight to the missing persons reports.
Thank you.
That very same day, police received a fax from a woman named Vanessa Lowe. Through a travel agent friend in South Africa, she reported her 32-year-old husband missing.
Staff Sergeant Peter Lin showed me a fax copy of a missing South African by the name of Gerard Lowe, and we thought that it could be a good start for us to start our investigation.
At the airport in Singapore.
For Gerard Lowe, it was the first time he had visited the island nation.
That's everything you need?
Look, check out this.
Always reliable and considerate, he gave his wife his travel itinerary.
I think it's the cheapest at this shop.
And at the airport in Johannesburg, he left her a message saying he would contact her on arrival in Singapore.
I'll talk to you when I get into Singapore. Take care. Love you.
When he failed to call home, Vanessa Lowe knew something was wrong.
Why hasn't he called?
What she didn't know was that it would be the last time she would ever hear from her husband. As detectives started to retrace his movements, they found that Gerard George Lowe was last seen checking into Singapore's Riverview Hotel 5 days earlier. But he wasn't alone.
We also found out that he had checked in with another male Caucasian, which we later established to be Simon Davis.
As investigators entered room 1511, where Lowe had been staying, they walked straight into a crime scene.
The moment we entered the room, there was this stench of smell, stench of death. It is a common stench as homicide detectives that we usually smell at the crime scene. Obviously, we were looking for blood. By the way the bodies were cut up, there'll be a large amount of blood. But when we searched thoroughly in the room, disappointingly, we did not find any blood at all. Next, we moved to the toilet. Looking at the bathtub itself, we gathered that it was an ideal place to cut up the bodies with running water and drain the blood away. But in my mind that time, there got to be more blood. So what I did was, I lay down on the toilet floor, looking up at the toilet sink, every nooks and corner, and true enough, there was a patch of blood about the size of a 20-cent coin.
Suspecting the worst, detectives immediately set about linking the blood in room 1511 to missing South African Gerard George Lowe. But Simon Davis, the last man seen checking in with Lowe, was nowhere to be found.
We immediately issued a police gazette on stop list. At the same time, we have alerted the Thai police, although they confirmed that Simon Davis has gone to Thailand, but they can't tell his exact whereabouts.
With no other leads, police in Singapore start the search. On March 13, 1995, 2 decomposed legs were found floating along Clifford Pier, Singapore. That same day, 32-year-old South African tourist Gerard George Lowe was reported missing by his wife. After discovering traces of blood in room 1511 of the Riverview Hotel, where Lowe was last seen alive, Singapore detectives sent an urgent appeal to South Africa, requesting blood samples from Lowe's sister, Terry Gillette. The very next day, the blood arrived. DNA extracted from the blood of Lowe's sister not only proved a sibling match to the severed legs found floating off Clifford Pier, but also to the blood found in the bathroom of room 1511. Then, a few days later, confirmation came in the form of another grisly discovery. The decomposed thighs and torso, also belonging to that of Gerard George Lowe. The method of dismemberment bore striking similarities to the legs found just days before. But other than identification, the body parts did not give the police any further clues.
It was not possible to determine the cause of death because the head was never found, so it was not possible to exclude whether there was head injury or otherwise. There was no evidence of any serious injury that could have caused death or contributed to death based on the recovery of the torso as well as the limbs.
Gerard George Lowe, a first-time traveler in Singapore, had checked into a hotel room with a man called Simon Davis, but had never checked out.
Eventually, we traced this Simon Davis to be John Martin Scripps. He had made a passport application at the British High Commission in Singapore. From there, we managed to gather all the details about Simon Davis. We contacted police in Scotland Yard and requested their help to trace Simon Davis. Scotland Yard informed us that the actual Simon Davis is still in UK. They came back to us and told us that actually Simon Davis had lost his birth certificate. And apparently, his ex-prison mate by the name of John Martin Scripps, who used to visit him during the weekend for good behavior, has stolen his birth cert and applied for a passport. We also found out that actually John Martin Scripps had escaped from prison during his home leave.
The name Simon Davis was a pseudonym for John Martin Scripps, a semi-literate petty criminal who had spent most of his life in and out of jail in the UK. John Martin Scripps was born in Letchworth, Hertfordshire on December 9th, 1959. Being the only boy in the family, he spent much of his childhood traveling around the country with his father, an East End lorry driver. It was a close, enduring relationship, but when Scripps was 9 years old, his father committed suicide. Behavioral problems soon followed. Andrew Drummond, a Bangkok-based journalist, was assigned to the Scripps story by several London newspapers.
Well, you know, he'd been brought up in London as a kid. He was taken to the Isle of Wight, an island off the south of England, and the family ran a guest house there. But when he became a teenager, he was always getting into trouble. He was mischievous, as his mother would say. Actually, he was more than mischievous. He started burglaring houses in his teens and became a career, what we would say is a career criminal.
Although Scripps was constantly in trouble with the law, there was never any evidence of violence attached to his character. Edmund Pereira, Scripps' defense lawyer, remembers his former client.
Yes, we did some getting up about him, about his background, and what surprised me about his background was that he had no incidents or history of violence, nothing whatsoever. He has a very impressive track record of antecedents involving petty thefts, burglary, and I think there was some drug-related offenses.
Although a full-time opportunistic criminal, Scripps continued to travel. But without his father, Scripps' movements were undisciplined and random.
Martin Scripps has a habit of never coming back. I mean, even as a teenager, he was sent by the school he was at on an Army Cadet Force training camp in France, and he disappeared from that, and there was a hue and cry looking for him then, and he was just off chasing girls or something like that.
It was not long before he saw one girl he just could not resist. Maria Pilar, a 15-year-old Mexican whom he had met in Montreal on one of his overseas trips. The attraction was mutual, and he took her back to London where they married. He was 21, she was 17. But not long after, Scripps was charged with 10 counts of theft and burglary. To top it off, he assaulted a police constable during his arrest and was given a 3-year jail sentence.
When Maria got to the UK, she realized what her boyfriend's occupation was. It was a burglar, a professional burglar of, you know, big stately homes and country houses. She thought he was into import and export, but didn't really question what he did. But now she knew the truth when she got back to the UK.
In June 1985, while on home leave, Scripps absconded and committed more burglaries. He was handed a further 3-year sentence, and this time, Maria filed for a divorce.
I mean, she told me about her life with Scripps. I mean, he was devoted to her, and almost like a lapdog in the early days. When he repeatedly started going back to prison, she called it a day. She left him and went on to marry a British policeman, who in fact became part of the royal family's protection squad. When he found out that Maria was seeing a policeman, I mean, she said he attempted to kill her, but I mean, he didn't. I mean, he strangled her, and what she described as being fairly close to passing out.
And then he pursued her and, made life difficult, I believe, also for her husband. Like breaking into the flat, stealing his clothes, and it just made things very difficult until she left the husband.
Divorced from Maria, Scripps moved on to bigger and bolder crimes. A courier for hard drugs.
He was in and out of jail all over the UK, initially for country house burglaries. And then, of course, he went to prison. He claims he met people doing other stuff. And then he went traveling the world, doing drugs. Cocaine from Colombia, heroin from Southeast Asia.
In a drug run between Asia and Europe in 1987, he was arrested at Heathrow Airport for suspected drug trafficking. A safe deposit key found on him led to a bank in Singapore, where he had stashed 1.5 kilos of heroin worth $1 million. He was sentenced to 7 years. But once more, while on home leave, he escaped.
Well, in Britain, there's a system under which prisoners occasionally can go home on leave for 2 or 3 days to see their family. And then they're meant to report back to the prison the next week. Well, Scripps never did.
Scripps continued to run drugs during his home leave, but while serving out his sentence on the inside, he proved himself a model prisoner. So much so that he got transferred from Albany to Mount Prison in Hertfordshire for good behavior. Scripps was promoted from menial worker to butcher, and it was here that he was taught how to use knives and assigned to work in the butchery department.
Essentially, he learned how to be a butcher in prison, and he learned how to bricklay. I mean, he didn't learn how to read or write, but I mean, he certainly used these skills in his trade, or what was to become his trade. And it was this sentence that he was serving and hadn't finished when he left the prison and started on his murderous, last trip.
Scripps was again given home leave for good behavior. In October 1994, the prison governor described him as being quiet and reserved, showed no history of violence, and as such, was no longer considered a risk. His mother, however, knew otherwise.
On the last occasion, before the killing spree, she said she had specifically told the authorities that he was going to run away. When he came home, he was morose, but, very good around the house, helped her with the garden and so on, but nevertheless had no intention of going back to jail.
I recall his mother's telling us that she warned the prison authorities then, do not let him out this weekend, because she heard that he's been selling off his TV sets and his radio and his personal equipment. So once that is clearly indication that he's no intention of coming back.
His mother was right. Scripps escaped prison for what would be the last time.
What happened is took a flight, and I think he went to South America to look for his ex-wife. And thereafter, I think things took to a turn. Unfortunately, many people were affected.
March 13th, 1995, the decomposing body parts of South African Gerard George Lowe were found floating off Clifford Pier in Singapore. Lowe was last seen alive with a British petty criminal called John Martin Scripps, who was traveling under the name of Simon Davis. 5 days earlier, March 8th, 1995, Changi Airport, Singapore. As soon as Gerard George Lowe cleared customs, he was approached by a man calling himself Simon Davis, a businessman selling clothes in Mexico, and on his way to Bangkok to do business.
He looks presentable and quite good looking for a male Caucasian. If he would approach anyone and start a conversation, there would be no difficulty for him to find a newfound friend.
I'm Simon Davis. I am.
Scripps targeted people, and very often they might be the people sitting next to him on the aircraft, or in the queue going through an immigration counter, or in a taxi queue.
Are you here on business? Oh, no, I'm actually doing some shopping.
And so people never suspected what was going to happen to them.
Looking for someone to share a hotel room?
After realizing Gerard Lowe was traveling alone, Scripps suggested sharing a room together to save cost. Lowe agreed.
Yeah, sure, why not?
They arrived at the Riverview Hotel and checked into room 1511.
Say, I'm sure. And that second shopping.
Within minutes, Scripps took a 10,000-volt stun gun and shocked Lowe into a state of paralysis before bludgeoning him to death with a hammer. With a foldable knife, he began to dismember the body, starting with the head. In a short time, Scripps had completely cut Lowe into various body parts.
It also have been likely to be a very sharp instrument. Could be a knife, could be a blade of some sort that you could cut the skin very quickly, without leaving a very jagged edges. And it has to be sharp enough to cut across ligaments and tendons as well.
He carried a set of butcher's knives around the world with him. And professional butcher's knives, not just any old knives. These were the real deal, so to speak.
After wrapping the body parts into plastic bags, Scripps put them into his luggage and stored it in the wardrobe. He then proceeded to create a new identity for himself by meticulously erasing Lowe's signature and photo from his passport. He did the same with Lowe's credit cards and then calmly went shopping, even finding time to attend a symphony at the Singapore Victoria Concert Hall that same day. But as Scripps was partaking in his newfound wealth, the body parts were rapidly decomposing. He knew the smell of rotting flesh would bring about suspicion. So the following morning, under the veil of darkness, Scripps slowly lugged the heavy suitcase with Lowe's dismembered body through the hotel lobby. He exited the building and made his way to the Singapore River behind the hotel. Security officer at the time, Jamil Snain, remembers that morning.
On the day in the morning, around 5:30, I saw John Martin bring out the luggage. So around 15 minutes, he's coming back. He's coming back, he rubbed his shoe at the carpet there. So he stand beside me to look me up and down. After that, he go to the lift to go his room, 15th floor.
On the morning of March 11th, 1995, 3 days after checking into the hotel, Scripps was gone.
Based from the hotel inquiries, the next morning, Simon Davis told the front office to delete the deceased name, giving reason that the deceased was homosexual and he had asked him to leave the hotel.
Scripps, however, made little effort in covering his tracks, and within hours, detectives had several leads to work from. An invoice for room 1511 of the Riverview Hotel contained records of telephone calls made from his room to a Thomas Cook office in Britain, as well as in Singapore.
Paper trails led us to the Thomas Cook Forex Exchange at Robbins Road. From our inquiries there, we found out that the accused had attempted to transfer a large amount of cash to his Citibank account in the US. As the transaction might take a few days to approve, he told the staff that he was going to Thailand and would come back to deal with the matter. He also bought an air ticket to Bangkok from the Thomas Cook travel section.
The Thomas Cook office in Singapore also reported finding a suspicious bag left behind at the reception area on March 11th, the same day Scripps disappeared. Office staff told investigators that it reeked of an extremely foul smell, mixed with the sweetness of a perfume that may have been used in an attempt to mask the putrid odor. Police officers also found CCTV images of Scripps withdrawing money from a local bank using Lowe's credit cards. Unfazed by his bloody escapade just hours earlier, Scripps went about his business in a calm and calculated manner.
His motivation was pure greed, the simplest way to get money, or somebody who's not that smart. The only devious part of it was the way he approached people and provided the opportunity himself, provide the opportunity to actually do it, to get into people's rooms and so on. But there was nothing smart about his crimes.
By now, the body parts case was becoming big news around the island, causing a potential problem for the police.
The media were eager to find out about the police development and investigation. We decided not to tell the media as yet, in order not to alarm Martin, or he would never come back.
The Singapore police were put on high alert for Scripps' return to the island nation. And on March 19th, 1995, 8 days after he left Singapore, Scripps entered the country right on cue as Simon Davis, triggering the silent alarm set up at the immigration point.
It's going to be long.
On 19 March 1995, he returned to Singapore to settle his unfinished business at Thomas Cook. But this time, he had to settle his unfinished business with the police.
Scripps was immediately detained and led to a holding cell at the airport.
Can you release the handcuffs? They're really tight.
He appeared agitated. He smashed the glass panel on the holding area of the police post at Changi Airport Terminal 1. He then tried to cut his wrist with one of the broken glasses. However, he was stopped before he could cause more serious injury to himself.
Well, after Scripps killed Gerard Lowe, he left Singapore, went up to Thailand, and then he came back again. And he couldn't understand why he was arrested. He thought the body had been disposed of adequately or professionally, and he couldn't see any other crimes linked to him. But, you know, he'd returned to Singapore under the same name as he'd checked into the hotel in the first place. So, I mean, as soon as he hit the immigration in Singapore, you know, that was it.
When police searched Scripps' bag, they found more than a set of clothes. His possessions included an electrical stun device, a can of mace, handcuffs, 2 serrated knives, Swiss Army knives, a 1.3 kilogram hammer, credit cards, and the passports of Lowe and another family by the name of Darin and Sheila Damude.
Whose belongings are this?
Under Singapore law, the police can detain a person for not more than 48 hours without a court order. And even though damning evidence was mounting against him, Scripps refused to talk. Time was running out for the police.
In fact, I don't think he even gave the police his name. So much so that when they charged him in court, they produced his photograph and stated, "You, with a photograph of his picture, are charged in that you on this day committed this offense." That's very interesting. I've not come across a charge like that because he elected to remain silent.
He's a career criminal. He thinks, well, if I don't admit it, nobody can ever prove it. You know, don't say nothing, and they can never prove it. I mean, he was in jail in Singapore a long time. He said nothing.
To bring about a murder charge against Scripps, police needed to gather more evidence. And to buy them precious time, they charged him with forgery in one of Singapore's subordinate courts. It bought them 1 week, just enough time to discover another grisly set of secrets. In 1995, British tourist John Martin Scripps was arrested in Singapore's Changi Airport under suspicion of the murder of a South African tourist by the name of Gerard Lowe. Scripps remained silent and was detained on charges of forgery, falsifying his passport, credit cards, and traveling under someone else's name, Simon Davis. With only 1 week to legally detain Scripps, police had to make a case of murder against him, or let him go.
I'm Staff Sergeant Zainab.
With the passports of a Canadian mother and son found in Scripps' possession, Singapore police immediately alerted the authorities in Thailand. Fearing for their lives, they told the Thai authorities of the modus operandi Scripps used at airports and of the body parts that followed.
We had worked closely with the Royal Thai Police and the Canadian Police, and we found out that John Martin Scripps had checked in the same hotel with the 2 Canadians.
The resort island of Phuket, located in the Andaman Sea off southern Thailand, has always been a popular tourist destination in Southeast Asia. On March 15, 1995, Canadian mother and son Sheila Damude and Darin Damude came to Phuket for a week's holiday from British Columbia, Canada. Scripps, after spending a week in Singapore, befriended the unsuspecting couple at Phuket International Airport.
How do you do?
Are you here on holiday?
Yes, we are. Our first time.
To the Damudes, he was simply a friendly face in a foreign land, and the 3 of them made their way to a popular Phuket hotel, Nilly's Marina Inn, overlooking the famous Patron beach. They checked into adjacent rooms and arranged to meet the next morning. For Scripps, he was simply biding his time. a.m. the next morning, he knocked on room 43 for his breakfast appointment with the Damudes. What happened next was just cold-blooded murder.
You've got a lovely view from your balcony, Tim.
Yeah, it's great. Oh, don't forget to...
The murder scene was eerily similar to that of Singapore. Once again, Scripps made the bathroom his workspace of choice. It took him slightly less than an hour to butcher both bodies. And then, as he did in Singapore, he cleaned up the crime scene and disposed of the body parts. Like clockwork, Scripps sat down to begin the task of doctoring Sheila and Darin Damude's personal documents, allowing him to use their traveler's checks as well as the credit cards. But once again, Scripps proved meticulous in killing and dismembering his victims, but thoughtless in planning his getaway, helping the police in Singapore gather the evidence they needed to bring a murder trial against him.
Subsequent trips made to Phuket, Thailand, to retrace the movement of the Canadians to link their death to John Martin Scripps. At the same time, we also want to obtain similar facts of evidence, the way he had killed the South African and the Canadians, to show the similarities of the manner he had cut up the bodies and disposed of the body parts. There were more traces of blood compared to the hotel room in Singapore. There were blood on the carpet floor, there were blood on the curtains, on the sliding door. There was also blood in the toilet.
Thai immigration records had shown that the Damudes had entered the country via Bangkok, but there was no record of them leaving. Tracing Scripps' movements, however, was easy.
Do you remember picking this man up?
Initially, the witnesses were reluctant to talk, but after much persuasion, the taxi driver remembered ferrying John Martins and the two Canadians from Phuket Airport to the hotel.
One man, one lady cup. As this man?
I remember.
The staff of the hotel remembered that John Martin came with the two Canadians and registered at the counter. Right? And she also remembers seeing John Martin Scripps leaving the hotel on several occasions with garbage bag, and he was seen riding off in a motorcycle. Soon after that, the Canadians were never seen again.
Thai police officers later discovered two human heads in a disused tin mine lying 50 meters apart from each other. Both were in an advanced state of decomposition. A torso, arms and legs were also found along a small road just 900 meters away from Nili's Marina Inn. Like the heads, they were badly decomposed, and visual identification was impossible. Medical investigations later would show that the body parts belonged to both a male and a female Caucasian.
Body parts that were found in Phuket were all disarticulated at the joint, and these bore the same hallmarks to the case in Singapore.
Linking the deaths in Thailand to Scripps was the vital breakthrough police needed to lay down a murder charge. They had already proved that Simon Davis and John Martin Scripps were in fact the same person, and that Scripps had been the last person seen with Gerard Lowe at the Riverview Hotel, Singapore. On October 25th, 1995, the trial of John Martin Scripps began. It made international headlines, with newspapers highlighting Scripps' nonchalant approach to murder, saying that he seemed to walk a fine line between a pathological serial killer and a desperate man with a death wish of his own.
There was evidence of him meeting the deceased at the airport, and then the meeting in the hotel, and the next thing you know that John Martin was occupying the deceased Maud's and his son's room. And he signed off their names, I think, in the receipts. And coupled with the fact that at the time of his arrest, he had properties of the deceased person on him. So it was a difficult task for the defense.
Well, if you look historically at serial killers, if you look at, say, Jack the Ripper or the Boston Strangler, these people all had an aura about them. They had some sort of guile. They were ahead of the police all the time. And Scripps came out as really a nobody in comparison. No plan, just the plan only was who is the next victim.
During the court trial, the prosecution highlighted that Scripps built up a reputation of befriending tourists, killing them, and then dismembering their bodies. His motivation was simply robbery. Although the focus was on the death of Gerard George Lowe, the prosecution also introduced evidence from the murder of the Canadian mother and son in Thailand.
Forensic evidence was introduced. I think the main idea why the prosecution introduced the Phuket murders was to show similar fact evidence whereby the two deceased, I think Madam Maud and her son, were killed in similar fashion as the deceased in Singapore.
Faced with 12 charges, including that of murder, the ever-confident John Martin Scripps now saw the severity of the case and asked for a top defense lawyer.
I received a call from the Registrar Supreme Court on a Saturday morning to see John Martin. Initially, I was quite reluctant, but he told me that the accused was on a hunger strike, and he had asked to see counsel, and he had asked to see me. Well, when I first saw John Martin,
hello, Mr. Martin.
He cried. He was in tears. And he looked at me and he cried. And the first words he uttered was, "I want to see my mama, my mother." And I was quite surprised. Here is this man who's been accused of all this heinous crime, and there's asking for his mother. Well, the primary defense of the accused person was one of sudden fight and also provocation. Sudden fight because he said that he was, at the time, just prior to the incident, he was asleep. And then the deceased woken him up by, touching his rear. So he said he just suddenly reacted, and he thought the deceased was going to attack him. Then the events thereafter, he had difficulty explaining. He admitted he was responsible for the death of the deceased. He never denied that. He said he was so distressed, he left the hotel and went to meet a friend in Sentosa. And the friend told him to stay there, and then what he learned later, the friend must have disposed of the body of the deceased. The prosecution pushed him to give us the name of the friend who he was referring to. Of course, he refused. He said he was afraid for the safety of his family. Then he also told the court that the friend moved from the Sentosa hotel to a hotel somewhere in the Marina Square area. So I think the investigating officers checked all the guest register book of these hotels at the Marina Square area to see whether there's any guest with a similar name from that of a Sentosa hotel. So, to match up with the John Martin's testimonies, they found none.
Well, throughout this case, John Martin Scripps has talked about a mystery figure in the background. He's referred to a mystery figure in Singapore who took away the body and disposed of it. When he talks about the Damudes who were murdered in Thailand, he denies anything about the murder, but then it slipped out in conversation that, the bodies were disposed of by somebody else. So there is this mystery figure, and nobody believes this figure exists, of course.
So that blew a big hole in John Martin's supposed explanation, for this mysterious friend he had.
He was compulsive and unskilled liar. That's the thing about Scripps. Once you spoke to him, you just knew he wasn't telling the truth. Yet he believed that you believed him.
With so many inconsistencies in his statements, the prosecution swiftly managed to prove that Scripps was not only a killer, but also a storyteller. On November 10th, 1995, after a 16-day trial, the Singapore High Court returned a guilty verdict. John Martin Scripps was found guilty in the murder of Gerard George Lowe under Singapore law. Singapore, November 10th, 1995. After a 16-day trial, John Martin Scripps was found guilty of the murder of Gerard George Lowe and sentenced to hang.
Immediately we filed a notice of appeal, but soon after, John Martin is given us very firm instructions, orally and also confirmed in writing, that he did not wish to appeal. I don't want to appeal to anybody. If they want to take me away, let them take me away. That was his... in fact, those were his words, if I can recall.
Although Scripps was convicted of the murder of Gerard George Lowe in Singapore, he was never charged for the 2 murders in Thailand. Among the various articles found in his possessions were also documents belonging to a British man by the name of Timothy McDowell.
But one case in particular drew attention was the death of a young English boy. He was reported missing by his family, but some 10,000 or 20,000 pounds were drawn from his account in San Francisco or somewhere. And his particulars were found on John Martin, his cards, bank book, or bank cards, credit cards.
It was in the months before Scripps arrived in Singapore that the young British graduate went missing. Authorities had discovered that after escaping prison in the UK for the last time, Scripps went in search of his ex-wife, Maria Pilar Arellanes.
So he then tracked her down to Mexico, and I think hoped he could start up this relationship again. But she wasn't having any of it. But it was in those months in Cancun, Mexico, that he met Timothy McDowell. And she told me, she spoke about Timothy McDowell. She said, you know, John used to go out and play or scuba dive with him and go out and partying with him on a number of occasions. And then Timothy McDowell just disappeared. And one day, Scripps came in and his expression had changed, his mood had changed. He was off. She knew he was going to go, and she didn't know why. But I suspect it was the day he killed Timothy McDowell.
Yeah, one of my last meetings, I think one of the last few meetings I had concerned a request by Scotland Yard to interview him. This is concerning the death of Mr. McDowell. So I told John Martin, you know, listen, the police officers are here from Scotland Yard. Give them a bit of your time, answer their questions. Help them to put an end to this issue of McDowell's matter.
The request for closure on McDowell triggered a response no one was prepared for. Least of all, his defense lawyer.
When he heard that the officers were there waiting to interview him, he went into a rage. I've never seen that part of John Martin. I mean, by gosh, he just stood up and he just threw himself at me. Fortunately, there was this huge glass divide, and he banged and pounded on that glass and shouted at me and said, "How dare you bring the officers here?" Whoa, I was stunned. I was shocked. I didn't know what to do. I was just too shocked. And I took a few steps back and I just walked out of that room. And he was shouting in a rage.
No, there's never been any closure on the Timothy McDowell case, although, you know, everything points to John Martin Scripps as being the person responsible for his death. McDowell's family, I'm afraid, Scripps took that with him to the grave. He would never admit it. And he would throw tantrums when asked about it.
In the months leading up to his hanging, Martin wrote a series of poems about the emptiness inside him and lamented that no one had loved him besides his family and his ex-wife, Maria.
Maria didn't want to go see him, and she didn't really want any contact with him. Yet, you know, you could feel she felt some sort of pain on his behalf. He had sent her letters, love letters. He sent her poems. He had a romantic image of, you know, her and old Mexico and her roots and so on, and you know, and spoke about it in these rather semi-literate poems. And it showed that he couldn't really write English, but obviously filled with emotion.
Well, I think this case will go in the annals of the criminal trials as a case whereby the accused person is one who's known to be a serial killer with an international trail, meeting his end in Singapore. You know, there was no need for John Martin to come back to Singapore from Bangkok.